Why did German soldiers continue fighting so relentlessly and brutally in 1944 and 1945, long after defeat was certain? It is a question asked for 80 years. Why new divisions were still being formed as late as January 1945? Why the final phase of the war became a battle of total annihilation, not for territory, not for victory, but for survival? The armies of the Reich ceased to fight as conventional forces and became moving formations with a single objective: delay destruction and reach the West. Medals, ideology, and ground no longer mattered. Staying alive did. In the autumn of 1944, the German war effort crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. What had been a war of conquest, then a war of defense, then a war of survival, now became something else entirely. It became a war of death. The transformation was not gradual. It arrived suddenly, carried on the testimonies of refugees fleeing across the East Prussian border in late October, their faces marked not by exhaustion, but by something beyond exhaustion, beyond terror, beyond anything the German home front had yet witnessed. The village of Nemmersdorf, a small farming community just inside the East Prussian frontier, fell to Soviet forces on October 21, 1944. German forces retook it the following day. What they found there would fracture the last psychological defenses of the Eastern Front. The bodies of German civilians, women and children among them, had been mutilated and killed with methodical brutality. Wehrmacht photographers documented the scene. Goebbels' propaganda ministry ensured the images reached every corner of the Reich. Whether the scale of atrocity matched the propaganda was almost irrelevant. The psychological damage was total and immediate. Nemmersdorf became the single word that answered every question about what surrender to the Red Army would mean. It transformed an abstract fear into concrete certainty. For German soldiers on the Eastern Front, Nemmersdorf was the moment the war changed definition. Officers who had fought since 1941 understood immediately that the rules governing this conflict had been rewritten. There would be no armistice, no negotiated withdrawal, no honourable capitulation. The Eastern Front was no longer a place where military logic applied. It had become a zone where survival depended entirely on preventing Soviet forces from crossing into German territory, and failing that, on moving west as quickly as possible. Every soldier now carried the calculation in his mind with crystalline clarity. Surrender to Anglo-American forces meant prisoner of war camps and eventual return home. Surrender to Soviet forces meant probable death, either immediate or delayed, in the labor camps of Siberia. This was not propaganda. It was the assessment made by frontline soldiers based on what they had witnessed and what they now expected. The immediate aftermath of Nemmersdorf saw German defences in East Prussia stiffen with desperate intensity. General Friedrich Hossbach's Fourth Army and General Hans Gollnick's formations threw everything available at the Soviet penetrations. For a brief moment, in late October and early November, the lines stabilized. Soviet forces withdrew across the frontier. German civilians who had begun fleeing westward returned to their farms. The Nazi Party district leaders assured the population that the danger had passed, that the Wehrmacht remained capable of protecting German soil. This was the last moment when such assurances could be believed. It was also the last moment when retreat was officially forbidden, but practically unnecessary. By January, both conditions would reverse. Throughout November and December 1944, the German military leadership faced a problem without solution. The Eastern Front now stretched across a vast arc from the Baltic to the Adriatic, and every sector was under pressure. Army Group Center had been obliterated in the summer destruction of Belarus. Army Group North was cut off in the Courland Peninsula, an entire army group trapped against the Baltic Sea with no prospect of relief and no permission to evacuate. Army Group South faced mounting Soviet strength in Hungary, where the battle for Budapest was consuming German reserves at catastrophic rates. Army Group A, redesignated Army Group Center after the summer disasters, held a shrinking perimeter in Poland with exhausted divisions that existed more on paper than in reality. The strategic situation permitted no reserves, no rotations, no elastic defense. Every kilometre of ground lost brought Soviet artillery closer to German cities. Every attempt to hold ground consumed divisions that could not be replaced. The Courland pocket illustrated the pathology of German strategic thinking in this terminal phase. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1944, Army Group North remained bottled up on the Courland Peninsula in Latvia, cut off from the rest of the German front by Soviet advances to the Baltic coast. Nearly 30 divisions, including some of the Wehrmacht's finest remaining formations, sat idle while the front elsewhere collapsed. Hitler refused to authorize evacuation. The official reasoning invoked the need to protect German naval bases and tie down Soviet forces. The actual reason was psychological. To evacuate Courland was to admit that German forces could no longer hold territory in the east, that the entire strategic position had become untenable. The troops in Courland fought competently, mounted local counterattacks, maintained discipline. They were also strategically irrelevant. Every soldier, every tank, every artillery piece trapped in Courland was a resource unavailable elsewhere, subtracted from the calculations of commanders trying to hold back Soviet offensives with formations that existed only as organizational charts. By late December 1944, German intelligence had compiled detailed assessments of Soviet preparations for the winter offensive. The concentrations of forces along the Vistula River in Poland were impossible to conceal. Soviet bridgeheads at Magnusio, Puławy and Barano bulged with men and material. Reconnaissance flights photographed the build-up. Prisoner interrogations confirmed the timing. The German High Command understood that a massive offensive was imminent, probably in mid-January. They also understood that German forces lacked the strength to stop it. The defensive positions along the Vistula were thinly manned. The reserves were non-existent. The mobile formations had been burned out in the autumn fighting. What remained were second-line infantry divisions, Volkssturm militia battalions, and the increasingly fantastical expectations of Hitler's headquarters. The Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive began on January 12, 1945. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's first Belarusian front and Marshal Ivan Konev's first Ukrainian front smashed through German defences with overwhelming force. The scale of the operation dwarfed anything yet seen on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces deployed over 2 million men, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces. German forces in the path of the offensive numbered fewer than 400,000 combat troops, backed by divisions that were divisions in name only. The breakthrough was achieved within 48 hours. By January 15th, Soviet tank formations were racing across the Polish plain toward the German frontier, advancing at speeds that made defensive improvisation impossible. For German commanders facing the Vistula-Oder offensive, the experience was one of complete systemic collapse. Units reported Soviet penetrations, requested permission to withdraw, received orders to hold their positions, then found themselves encircled or overrun before clarifications could arrive. Communication networks failed under the volume of reports. Supply lines evaporated as Soviet tank columns cut lateral roads. Formations ceased to exist, not because they were destroyed in battle, but because they disintegrated during attempted retreats, soldiers abandoning equipment to move faster, officers losing contact with their men, entire divisions dissolving into refugee columns. The Wehrmacht had experienced retreats before, chaotic retreats, disastrous retreats, but nothing prepared German soldiers for the velocity and totality of the January collapse. The civilian population of Eastern Germany learned of the Soviet offensive not through official announcements, but through the sudden appearance of Wehrmacht soldiers retreating through their towns, and then through the arrival of refugees from further east. The Nazi Party district leaders maintained their assurances. Evacuation orders were delayed, contradictory, or withheld entirely, partly because admitting the need to evacuate was politically unthinkable, partly because party officials feared being accused of defeatism, partly because they themselves could not believe the situation had deteriorated so catastrophically so quickly. In many towns and cities across East Prussia, Pomerania and Silesia, civilians received no official warning at all. They simply woke to find Soviet forces approaching and had to make instant decisions about flight with no preparation, no transportation, no destination. East Prussia became the epicenter of civilizational collapse. The province had been part of Germany for 7 centuries, longer than Prussia had existed as a state. Its population had never experienced occupation, had never fled from anything. In January 1945, they fled. The exodus began as organized columns of refugees traveling westward by road and rail, and within days devolved into chaotic masses of civilians trudging through snow with whatever possessions they could carry. The roads westward became choked with horse-drawn wagons, handcarts, people on foot. Luftwaffe fighters strafed these columns, mistaking them for Soviet movements. Soviet aircraft strafed them deliberately. The columns continued moving westward regardless, because eastward meant certain death and southward meant nothing but more Soviet advances. The Fourth Army, under General Friedrich Hossbach, found itself defending East Prussia with formations that had been bled white in the autumn fighting and had received no meaningful replacements. Hossbach understood his mission was impossible. He also understood that attempting to withdraw without authorization would result in his immediate relief and probable execution. In late January, as Soviet forces drove deeper into East Prussia from the south and east, Hossbach made the decision to withdraw westward without permission, prioritizing the survival of his army over obedience to directives that bore no relationship to reality. Hitler relieved him of command. The Fourth Army continued retreating regardless, because by this point the choice was between retreat and annihilation. By early February 1945, East Prussia had been cut off from the rest of Germany. Soviet forces reached the Baltic coast near Elbing, severing the land corridor. What remained of German forces in East Prussia were now trapped in a series of shrinking pockets, pressed against the sea with their backs to the Baltic. The largest of these pockets formed around Königsberg, the provincial capital and the historical heart of Prussian identity. The second major pocket formed in the Heiligenbeil area, a triangle of marshy ground west of Königsberg, where remnants of the Fourth Army established defensive positions. A third pocket held the Samland Peninsula, a narrow spit of land jutting into the Baltic, valuable primarily because it contained the port of Pillau, the last remaining evacuation point for German forces and civilians, trapped in the collapsing East Prussian cauldron. The Heiligenbeil pocket became a concentrated demonstration of what late-war German defense meant. The Fourth Army and associated formations, perhaps 100,000 combat troops, plus an unknown number of stragglers and civilians, held a perimeter roughly 40 kilometers wide and 20 deep. They had no strategic purpose. They could not break out. They could not be reinforced. They could affect the course of the war in no way whatsoever. What they could do was delay their own destruction for as long as ammunition and rations held out, and in delaying their destruction, they provided time for naval evacuation efforts to pull civilians out through Pillau. The defense of Heiligenbeil was not about holding ground. It was about buying time measured in days so that ships could make a few more runs, so that a few thousand more refugees might reach the western zones before the pocket collapsed. Soviet forces surrounding the Heiligenbeil pocket made no particular hurry to reduce it. They had isolated it, they could destroy it whenever convenient, and the forces trapped inside posed no threat to subsequent Soviet operations. The Germans inside the pocket understood this perfectly. They also understood that the moment they surrendered, or the moment the perimeter collapsed, every man who could not reach the sea before Soviet infantry arrived would either be killed immediately or shipped to labor camps from which few would return. This knowledge produced a peculiar intensity of resistance. German soldiers fought not for Hitler, not for the Reich, not for any ideological cause, but because fighting meant delay, and delay meant some chance, however slim, that naval evacuation might save them before the end. The defense of the Heiligenbeil pocket lasted from late January through March 1945. The civilians were urged to leave as early as November, but most refused, thinking the city would be spared, as it had not been touched. My wife had family in Jena and left in December, but I stayed as part of the defense. I was part of the inner city defense and organization. My main job was overseeing the medical help for the soldiers and civilians. I picked places to store medicine and supplies to protect them. When more soldiers came into the city from recent battles, they urged the civilians to flee, telling horrid stories about what they saw in Poland and Hungary. The Soviet army was committing murder for anyone fighting or aiding Germany. By January, the front was on our doorstep. Soviet artillery was shelling the city, and we saw planes overhead for the first time. Our defences were pitiful. We had nothing heavy to fight with, and I believe we could only muster 2 damaged heavy panzers. Our soldiers put the Soviets on notice we intended to hold, and they repulsed many early attacks, causing heavy losses. This increased the artillery attacks, which now started to wreck the city. Our fire brigades were kept busy and often had to just let whole blocks burn. The only mass effort was when people were trapped. Due to this, Hanke now forced the civilians to leave, which many still defied us and wanted to stay put and help fight. An example, I was with a police unit going door to door, and a family said this was their city and they would die in it if it were God's will. We stressed the Soviets would soon surround the city, and they were unmoved. I learned later, forced evacuations caused mass casualties as it was very cold. Some estimates say 100,000 civilians froze to death, and the planes strafed these long columns of refugees, killing thousands. What the planes did not claim, the partisans did, who advanced with the Soviets taking further tolls. The weather was brutal, and anyone wounded had little chance to survive. It was pure hell, as the enemy showed no mercy or compassion. They signed some parts of the Geneva Convention, but the main parts about prisoners of war and civilians they refused. To them it was no mercy in war. Our men fought valiantly against overwhelming odds and held out. This ragtag army consisted of both German and European volunteers. I counted Hungarian, Italian, Dutch, Polish and Russians who stayed with us to fight. By April the city was in ruins, but our spirits were still high and we held the Soviets at bay. They did take our airport, but we had another built in my area. Since the building had been destroyed, we ploughed away rubble so planes could land to bring supplies and remove wounded. It featured no dramatic counterattacks, no legendary stands, no moments of battlefield glory. It consisted of German soldiers firing until they ran out of ammunition, then retreating to the next defensive line, then repeating the process. Soviet artillery pounded the pocket methodically. Soviet infantry advanced through the frozen marshland in set-piece assaults that ground down German defences through sheer weight of metal. By mid-March, the pocket had shrunk to a perimeter measured in hundreds of meters. German soldiers abandoned their positions and ran for the beaches at Pillau, hoping to find transport aboard the ships still attempting evacuations. Many succeeded, most did not. When Soviet forces overran the final positions on March 29th, they found exhausted survivors too weak to run, and the frozen bodies of those who had tried and failed to reach the sea. Königsberg held out longer, but died harder. The city was surrounded in late January and besieged through February and March. Hitler declared it a fortress, which meant its garrison was forbidden to surrender or evacuate. General Otto Lasch commanded the defense with 4 understrength divisions, Volkssturm battalions, and miscellaneous units scraped together from training schools and administrative personnel. Königsberg had no strategic value. Its capture or defense affected nothing. Soviet forces could have bypassed it entirely and continued westward without consequence. They chose to reduce it because Königsberg was the capital of East Prussia, because its fall would have symbolic weight, and because reducing a major city provided experience for the assault on Berlin that everyone knew was coming. The siege of Königsberg followed the pattern of Soviet urban warfare doctrine refined at Stalingrad and perfected through 3 years of subsequent city fighting. Soviet artillery methodically demolished the city block by block. Soviet infantry assaults followed the artillery preparations, advancing through the rubble in small groups, clearing buildings systematically. German defenders fell back from the outer districts to the inner city, from the inner city to the central fortress zones, from the fortress zones to isolated pockets of resistance that held out for hours or days before being overwhelmed. By early April, the city was a ruin inhabited by corpses. German forces surrendered on April 9th, not because they chose to, but because they had run out of ammunition, food, and space. The evacuation of East Prussia by sea represented one of the largest maritime rescue operations in history and one of the least remembered. Operation Hannibal, initiated in January 1945, employed every available German naval vessel to evacuate military personnel and civilians from the collapsing East Prussian pockets. Over 2 million people were evacuated between January and May 1945, transported across the Baltic to ports in western Pomerania and Denmark. The operation succeeded despite Soviet submarine attacks, despite Soviet air attacks, despite overloaded ships sinking in winter storms, despite the complete absence of naval air cover. It succeeded because the alternative to boarding a ship was remaining in East Prussia, and remaining in East Prussia meant death. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30th, 1945, illustrated the mathematics of desperation. The ship, a pre-war cruise liner converted to naval auxiliary service, departed from Gotenhafen overloaded with approximately 10,000 refugees and military personnel. Perhaps more, the exact number was never established. A Soviet submarine torpedoed the ship in the Baltic. Over 9,000 people drowned in the freezing water. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history. News of the sinking circulated among the refugee columns still trying to reach evacuation ports. It changed nothing. They continued moving toward the ports because the calculus was binary. Staying meant certain death. Boarding a ship meant some chance of survival, even if that chance included the possibility of drowning. Given the choice between certain death and probable death, human beings choose probable death every time. The Samland Peninsula, the last piece of East Prussian territory remaining in German hands through April 1945, became a killing ground of unusual concentrated horror. Soviet forces advanced westward along the narrow peninsula toward Pillau, compressing German military formations and civilian refugees into an ever-shrinking perimeter. The only escape was by sea. The evacuation ships made their final runs under constant air attack, loading refugees from beaches while Soviet artillery fired on the embarkation points. German soldiers provided covering fire until the last ships departed, then attempted to fight their way aboard or surrendered to Soviet forces. Some units, knowing capture meant death, fought until their ammunition was exhausted and then committed suicide. The final German positions on the Samland Peninsula were overrun in late April. By that point, most people who could be evacuated had been evacuated. Those who remained were killed or captured. Parallel to the East Prussian disaster, Soviet forces drove westward across Pomerania toward the Baltic coast, aiming to cut off German forces still holding out in the region and to secure the approaches to Berlin. The East Pomeranian offensive began in late February 1945 with overwhelming Soviet superiority in men and materiel. German forces defending Pomerania consisted of understrength divisions from the Second Army and miscellaneous formations gathered under the newly created Army Group Vistula, commanded by Heinrich Himmler, who had no military experience whatsoever and whose appointment reflected Hitler's deteriorating grip on strategic reality. Himmler's tenure as Army Group commander lasted less than 2 months and was characterized by complete operational incompetence. German forces in Pomerania fought competently despite Himmler, not because of him, and their competence bought time, but nothing else. The German defense of Pomerania focused on holding the major coastal cities as long as possible to facilitate evacuation of civilians and military personnel by sea. Danzig held until March 30th. Gdynia fell a few days earlier. Kolberg, made famous by a propaganda film released in January 1945, depicting its defense during the Napoleonic Wars, fell on March 18th after a siege of several weeks. The propaganda value of these sieges was dubious. The military value was nil. What they accomplished was delaying the final Soviet advance toward Berlin by several weeks and providing additional time for naval evacuations that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The soldiers defending these cities understood they were not defending Germany. They were buying time measured in days so that ships could continue operating. In Silesia, the city of Breslau endured a siege that lasted from February through May 1945, longer than any other German city held out except Berlin. The garrison commander, General Hermann Niehoff, converted the city into a fortress with methodical thoroughness. He demolished residential buildings to create fields of fire. He conscripted the remaining civilian population into labor battalions. He established a defensive perimeter and held it against repeated Soviet assaults through sheer determination and the increasingly desperate knowledge that surrender meant captivity in the Soviet system. Breslau was supplied by air through a makeshift airfield constructed on the city's main boulevard. Luftwaffe transport aircraft flew supply missions through intense anti-aircraft fire, delivering ammunition and evacuating wounded until the final days of the war. The city finally surrendered on May 6th, 2 days before the war ended, not because it had been conquered, but because there was no longer any war to fight. The siege of Breslau demonstrated the transformation of German military culture in the war's final phase. Earlier in the conflict, German commanders had operated with tactical flexibility, withdrawing when positions became untenable, conducting mobile defense, prioritizing preservation of forces. By early 1945, such flexibility had been replaced by rigid adherence to fortress doctrine. Cities, designated as fortresses, were to be held regardless of military logic, regardless of cost, regardless of purpose. This shift reflected partly Hitler's obsession with holding ground at any cost, partly the Wehrmacht's institutional collapse, and partly the psychological reality that withdrawal no longer led to stabilization elsewhere, but merely to further withdrawal. If every retreat led only to the next retreat, then there was no longer any rational argument for retreating. Better to hold a fixed position until death than to participate in an endless withdrawal that led inevitably to the same end. The psychology of German soldiers during this terminal phase defies easy summary. They were not fighting for ideology. The grand narratives of racial struggle and Lebensraum had been replaced by the immediate calculus of survival. They were not fighting out of discipline, though discipline certainly remained a factor in units with competent leadership. They were fighting because fighting offered some chance of controlling the manner and timing of death, while surrender or flight offered only the certainty of dying in Soviet captivity. This produced behavior that appeared from outside as fanaticism, but was internally experienced as rational calculation. The soldier, who fought until his ammunition was exhausted, was not demonstrating ideological commitment. He was maximizing his probability of survival by remaining armed and dangerous for as long as possible, by staying with his unit where collective defense was possible, by delaying the moment of final vulnerability. South of the main Soviet drives toward Germany proper, the battle for Hungary consumed German reserves at a rate that the Wehrmacht could no longer sustain. Budapest had been encircled in late December 1944, trapping the 9th SS Mountain Corps and significant Hungarian forces in a siege that would last until mid-February. Hitler ordered multiple relief attempts, each of which achieved temporary penetrations of the Soviet encirclement and then collapsed, each of which consumed panzer divisions that could not be replaced. The defenders of Budapest fought through January with decreasing rations and ammunition, hoping each day that the promised relief would arrive. The relief never arrived in sufficient strength. The city fell, district by district, building by building, until the final defenders attempted a breakout on February 11th. Most were killed or captured. The relief attempts had sacrificed several panzer divisions for no result. The relief attempts for Budapest illustrated Hitler's disconnect from military reality. Each failed relief attempt was followed by orders for another relief attempt, using forces that existed only in Hitler's imagination. Divisions reported destroyed were ordered back into action. Tank units reporting 3 operational vehicles were expected to conduct offensive operations. The gap between the orders issued from Hitler's headquarters and the situation on the ground had become so vast that field commanders simply ignored directives that could not possibly be executed, gambling that by the time their disobedience was discovered, the tactical situation would have changed and the orders would be obsolete anyway. This breakdown of command authority meant that German forces operated in a state of semi-chaos, with local commanders making independent decisions based on immediate survival needs rather than strategic direction. After the fall of Budapest, Hitler conceived of one final offensive in Hungary, an operation that would stabilize the southern front, recapture the Hungarian oil fields, and demonstrate that the Wehrmacht retained offensive capability. This operation, codenamed Frühlingserwachen, or Spring Awakening, was launched in early March 1945 around Lake Balaton. It committed the 6th SS Panzer Army, including elite divisions like the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and Das Reich, equipped with the latest King Tiger tanks and supported by concentrated artillery. The offensive was Hitler's last roll of the dice, the final attempt to reverse the war's trajectory through a successful major operation. Spring Awakening failed within 10 days. German forces achieved initial penetrations but lacked the fuel, ammunition, and reserves to exploit them. Soviet defenses absorbed the attack, then counterattacked with overwhelming strength. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Germany's last major mobile reserve, was shattered. The King Tigers that had looked so impressive on paper broke down, ran out of fuel, or were destroyed by Soviet anti-tank weapons and artillery. By mid-March, German forces in Hungary were in full retreat. Soviet forces pursued them westward toward Vienna. The failure of Spring Awakening marked the end of German offensive capability. Everything from this point forward would be retreat, defense, and delay. The Vienna offensive in April 1945 brought the war to Austria with the same mechanical brutality that had characterized Soviet operations across Poland and eastern Germany. Soviet forces approached Vienna from the south and east. German forces defending the city consisted of exhausted remnants of the formations that had retreated from Hungary, plus Volkssturm battalions and miscellaneous units gathered from training bases and rear area installations. The defense of Vienna had no strategic purpose. The city could not be held. Its fall would not significantly delay the Soviet advance. What the defense accomplished was the destruction of the city through street fighting and the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians who might have survived had Vienna been declared an open city. The SS divisions fighting in the east during this final phase merit particular examination. These formations, particularly the foreign volunteer divisions, found themselves in an especially impossible position. The SS Nordland division, composed largely of Scandinavian volunteers, fought in Pomerania and then withdrew into the Berlin pocket. The French SS division Charlemagne fought in Pomerania as well, then withdrew to Berlin, where its survivors participated in the final defense of the city centre. These foreign volunteers had volunteered for a war against Bolshevism, for an ideological crusade that had promised a new European order. By early 1945, the ideological framework had completely dissolved. What remained was the cold knowledge that they had fought for Germany, that their own countries would view them as traitors, that capture by Soviet forces meant immediate execution, and that their only chance of survival lay in reaching the Western Allies. They fought with desperate intensity, not out of ideological commitment, but because they had nowhere else to go. The phenomenon of foreign volunteers fighting for Germany until the final collapse revealed the psychology of commitment in a lost cause. These men had made irreversible choices in 1941 or 1942, had burned bridges with their home countries, had invested years of their lives in military service for a cause that no longer existed. By 1945, they could not recant their earlier choices. They could not go home. They could not surrender without facing certain execution. The only path remaining was to continue fighting until they were killed, captured by Western Allied forces, or until the war ended and some possibility of escape emerged. This created a peculiar form of fanaticism that resembled ideological commitment, but was actually pure necessity. They fought as fanatics because the alternative to fighting was immediate death. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers faced similar but less absolute constraints. A German soldier could theoretically surrender to Soviet forces and survive captivity, though survival rates in Soviet camps were notoriously low. A German soldier on the Western Front could surrender to American or British forces with reasonable confidence of survival and eventual repatriation. The Eastern Front soldier calculated constantly which direction offered better survival odds. The calculus was complicated by the fact that Soviet forces approaching from the east had more reason to kill prisoners than Western Allied forces approaching from the west. Every soldier had heard the stories from Nemmersdorf and similar incidents. Every soldier understood that Soviet forces had witnessed German atrocities in Russia and had every reason to reciprocate. The binary choice was brutal in its simplicity. Move west and survive. Move east or stay in place and probably die. Goebbels' propaganda apparatus in the final months of the war abandoned all pretense of promising victory and instead weaponized fear. The newsreels showed Soviet atrocities. The radio broadcasts described in graphic detail what would happen to German women and children if Soviet forces occupied Germany. The posters plastered across German cities depicted Soviet soldiers as subhuman monsters. This propaganda was effective not because it was skillful, but because much of it was true. Soviet forces had committed atrocities. German civilians had been killed. The population did not need to be convinced that Soviet occupation would be catastrophic. They needed only to be reminded constantly so that fear would override all other considerations, including rational assessment of whether continued resistance served any purpose. The concept of total war, which Goebbels had proclaimed in his famous Sportpalast speech in February 1943, reached its fullest implementation in the winter and spring of 1945. Total war meant the complete mobilization of society for military purposes. It meant drafting men previously considered too old or too young. It meant conscripting women for war production and auxiliary military roles. It meant eliminating all civilian economic activity not directly supporting the war effort. By early 1945, total war meant something even more extreme. It meant the transformation of the entire German population into either soldiers or refugees, the elimination of any space for civilian existence, the conversion of all life into war. The Volkssturm, the People's Militia created in September 1944, embodied this total mobilization. Every male between 16 and 60 not already in the Wehrmacht or essential war industry was conscripted. The Volkssturm received minimal training, inadequate weapons, and no illusions about their military effectiveness. They were issued Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank weapons that required approaching within 30 meters of enemy tanks. They were given armbands designating them as military personnel, though whether Soviet forces would recognize these armbands as legitimizing combatant status was an open question. They were organized into battalions and assigned to defend their home districts. Their actual military value was minimal, their symbolic value was everything. The Volkssturm demonstrated that Germany would fight to the last man, that every city and town would be defended, that the war would continue until there was no one left to fight. The Hitler Youth, boys aged 14 to 18, were increasingly integrated into military formations in the final months. Some Hitler Youth units received genuine military training and equipment and fought with desperate courage born of youthful idealism not yet tempered by experience. Other Hitler Youth units were simply children handed weapons and told to defend positions against Soviet tanks. The deployment of children in combat reflected both the Wehrmacht's personnel exhaustion and the regime's willingness to sacrifice everything in a war that had already been lost. Commanders who had spent years developing professional military competence found themselves leading units that included grandfathers and children, trying to conduct tactical operations with forces that bore no resemblance to the armies they had commanded in 1941. The officer corps, the institutional spine of the German military, suffered complete erosion of trust in the final phase. Officers who issued retreat orders without authorization were relieved, arrested, or executed. Officers who held positions too long were accused of defeatism when their units were destroyed. The margin for effective command had narrowed to nothing. A competent officer in early 1945 faced an impossible choice. He could obey orders from above that bore no relationship to reality and watch his men die for no purpose. He could disobey orders and attempt to preserve his unit, risking court-martial and execution, or he could abandon command entirely and focus on personal survival. Many officers chose the third option. Units reported officers disappearing in the night, abandoning their commands, discarding their insignia, and trying to blend into refugee columns. The Wehrmacht had begun the war with an officer corps renowned for tactical skill and operational competence. It ended the war with an officer corps that had learned the primary lesson of late war service: obedience equals death. By March 1945, the Soviet advance had reached the Oder River, the last major geographical barrier before Berlin. German forces established defensive positions along the Oder, with what remained of Army Group Vistula in the north and Army Group Center in the south. These positions were fortified with the understanding that they represented the final line. There would be no withdrawal from the Oder, because west of the Oder was Berlin, and west of Berlin was nothing but the end. The Oder defences held through March and into April, not because they were particularly strong, but because Soviet forces paused to consolidate their gains, bring up supplies, and prepare for the final assault. The pause before Berlin gave German forces and civilians a brief window to understand what was coming. The Soviet artillery build-up on the Oder was visible to anyone with binoculars. The concentration of forces was impossible to conceal. Every soldier in the Oder defences knew that when the assault came, it would come with overwhelming strength, and that the defences would collapse within days. Every civilian in Berlin knew that the city would be fought over street by street, that the destruction would be total, and that survival would depend on being in the right place at the moment the fighting reached their district. The pause before the storm was characterized not by hope, but by grim preparation. People dug shelters, soldiers prepared demolitions, everyone waited. The final Soviet offensive toward Berlin began on April 16, 1945. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front attacked across the Oder directly toward Berlin. Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front attacked south of Berlin, aiming to encircle the city from the south while also driving westward toward the Elbe River and the Western Allied forces approaching from the west. The initial assault encountered fierce German resistance at the Silo Heights, where German forces had prepared the only significant defensive positions remaining. The battle for the Silo Heights lasted 3 days and cost Soviet forces thousands of casualties. German forces inflicted these casualties not because they expected to stop the Soviet advance, but because fighting was better than surrendering, because every day the Silo Heights held was one more day for civilians to flee westward, because dying in combat was better than dying in captivity. The Silo Heights fell on April 19th. Soviet tank formations burst through the German defences and raced toward Berlin. German forces, in the path of the advance, retreated toward the city or attempted to retreat south and west to avoid encirclement. The 9th Army, positioned south of Berlin, found itself cut off by Konev's advance and encircled in the forests east of Berlin near Halbe. What followed was one of the war's final annihilations, a concentrated demonstration of what happened to German forces caught in a Soviet pocket with no possibility of relief. The Halbe pocket became a killing zone of concentrated horror. The German 9th Army, perhaps 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers, plus unknown numbers of refugees who had attached themselves to military columns, was surrounded in forested terrain with limited roads and no prepared defensive positions. Soviet forces methodically compressed the pocket, using artillery and airstrikes to destroy German formations attempting to break out. German commanders organized breakout attempts toward the west, trying to reach American lines at the Elbe River. Some formations succeeded in breaking through Soviet encirclement, but most were destroyed in the attempt. The forests around Halbe filled with German corpses. Refugees caught in the pocket died alongside soldiers. The exact death toll was never established, but tens of thousands of German soldiers and civilians were killed in the week-long battle to reduce the Halbe pocket. Parallel to the battle for Berlin, Soviet forces launched their final offensive in Czechoslovakia. The Prague offensive, beginning on May 6, 1945, aimed to destroy the last organized German forces in the south and liberate the Czech capital before the war ended. German forces in Czechoslovakia consisted of Army Group Centre under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, perhaps 600,000 troops on paper, significantly fewer in reality. These forces were among the last German formations maintaining unit cohesion and defensive capability. They were also geographically positioned such that they could theoretically retreat westward into American custody rather than surrendering to Soviet forces. This possibility shaped every calculation made by German commanders in the final days. The German forces in Czechoslovakia faced the same binary choice as German forces everywhere in early May 1945. They could surrender to Soviet forces and face probable death in captivity. They could attempt to reach American lines and survive. The Prague offensive made the second option extremely difficult. Soviet forces drove westward with speed, calculated to cut off German retreat routes. German forces attempting to withdraw from Czechoslovakia found themselves racing Soviet tank columns for control of the mountain passes leading into Bavaria and Austria. Some formations succeeded in reaching American lines. Others were caught by Soviet forces and destroyed. Others surrendered to Czech partisans who had risen in Prague, and their fate varied depending on which partisan group captured them and what mood that group was in. The battle for Berlin itself was both the symbolic climax of the European war and a militarily meaningless atrocity. The city had no strategic value. Its capture would not shorten the war. Its defense served no military purpose. German forces defending Berlin consisted of Wehrmacht remnants, SS formations pulled from collapsing fronts elsewhere, Volkssturm battalions, Hitler Youth units, and miscellaneous troops scraped from training schools and administrative offices. Against this improvised defense, Soviet forces deployed overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and infantry, with a ruthlessness born of 4 years of total war, and a desire to finish the job by raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The battle for Berlin followed the pattern of Soviet urban warfare, refined through years of city fighting. Soviet artillery demolished districts before infantry advanced. Soviet infantry advanced in small assault groups, clearing buildings methodically. German defenders fell back from district to district, block to block, building to building, occasionally launching counterattacks that briefly stabilized sectors, but accomplished nothing beyond delaying the inevitable by hours. The defense of Berlin was characterized by isolated acts of desperate courage that had no effect on the battle's outcome. A Hitler youth boy knocking out a Soviet tank with a Panzerfaust changed nothing. An SS company holding a building for a day changed nothing. The city died, regardless. Hitler's suicide on April 30th removed the last pretense that the defense of Berlin served any purpose beyond dying slowly. The new government under Admiral Karl Dönitz immediately began attempting to negotiate surrender terms. Those surrender negotiations were complicated by the German desire to surrender only to Western Allied forces, while continuing to fight Soviet forces to allow maximum westward retreat of German formations. The Western Allies rejected this approach. Germany would surrender unconditionally to all Allied forces simultaneously, or continue fighting against all Allied forces until militarily destroyed. The arithmetic left no room for negotiation. The final days of the war saw German forces making desperate attempts to reach Western Allied lines. In Berlin, surviving garrison units attempted breakouts toward the northwest, trying to reach the Elbe River and American forces. Most of these breakouts failed. The attackers killed or captured within hours. In Czechoslovakia, entire German armies raced westward ahead of Soviet advances, abandoning equipment to move faster, hoping to surrender to Americans before Soviet forces overtook them. In the Baltic, the final German forces in the Courland pocket remained trapped, still receiving orders to hold their positions even as the war ended around them. They would surrender to Soviet forces on May 8th after fighting a war that had been meaningless for 6 months. The German instrument of surrender was signed on May 7, 1945, effective May 8th. The war in Europe was over. For German soldiers in Soviet custody, the war's end meant transfer to labor camps in Siberia, from which they might return in 5 or 10 years if they survived. For German soldiers in Western Allied custody, the war's end meant internment in POW camps and eventual release. The difference between these two fates had shaped every decision made by German soldiers and commanders in the final months. The westward imperative had been proven absolutely correct. Those who moved west survived. Those who did not move west died. The final transformation of the German war effort from October 1944 to May 1945 represented more than military defeat. It represented the collapse of the structures that had made Germany a functional state. The Wehrmacht had begun the war as a professional military organization operating under conventional military logic. It ended the war as a mobilized population fighting without strategy, without purpose, without hope, fighting only because not fighting meant death. The transformation from disciplined army to terrified mass occurred in stages, each stage marked by a rupture that destroyed another layer of normalcy. Nemmersdorf in October 1944 destroyed the illusion that the war could be lost honorably, that surrender remained a viable option, that Soviet occupation would resemble occupation by civilized military forces. The January 1945 Soviet offensive destroyed the illusion that the eastern territories could be defended, that the Wehrmacht retained sufficient strength to stabilize the front, that the war might somehow end in negotiated withdrawal. The failure of Spring Awakening in March destroyed the illusion that Germany retained offensive capability, that battlefield success remained possible, that the trajectory of the war might yet be reversed. The encirclement of Berlin in April destroyed the illusion that Germany could exist as a state, that civilian life would continue, that there was any future beyond death or captivity. The propaganda apparatus under Goebbels achieved in the final months something that propaganda rarely achieves. it became redundant. The fear that Goebbels's machine worked to instill in the German population was no longer manufactured fear. It was rational assessment of the situation based on direct evidence. German civilians fleeing westward were not fleeing from propaganda images of Soviet soldiers. They were fleeing from actual Soviet soldiers whose behavior matched or exceeded the propaganda descriptions. German soldiers fighting with fanatical intensity were not fighting because propaganda had convinced them of ideological necessity. They were fighting because they had calculated that fighting offered better survival odds than surrendering. The propaganda machine had been designed to manipulate psychology. By early 1945, it was simply documenting reality. The weaponization of fear as state policy reached its apotheosis in the regime's treatment of German soldiers attempting to withdraw without authorization. Field police units, Feldgendarmerie, established control points on roads leading westward with orders to arrest deserters and stragglers. Soldiers found away from their units without authorization were subject to immediate field trial and execution. Thousands of German soldiers were executed by their own forces for the crime of attempting to survive. The regime understood correctly that the threat of death at Soviet hands was insufficient to maintain discipline in collapsing formations. A soldier might risk death by advancing or death by surrendering and choose to surrender, but if the choice was death by advancing, death by surrendering, or certain death by withdrawing, the soldier would advance. The regime weaponized every possible fear simultaneously and used these fears to extract the final drops of military effectiveness from a dying army. The flying courts-martial, Fliegende Standgerichte, created in February 1945, made the threat of execution immediate and arbitrary. These military tribunals were authorized to travel to any front-line area, conduct field trials, and execute soldiers for defeatism, cowardice, or unauthorized withdrawal. The definition of these crimes was left deliberately vague. A soldier who retreated when ordered to hold his position faced execution. A soldier who held his position when retreat was tactically necessary faced encirclement and death. The soldier was forced to guess which interpretation would be applied to his situation, knowing that guessing incorrectly meant death, but that not acting also meant death. This produced a military culture where every decision was made under threat of execution from both directions, where courage and cowardice became indistinguishable, where the only obviously wrong action was doing nothing. The regime's treatment of German civilians attempting to flee westward was only marginally less ruthless. Nazi Party officials in eastern territories often blocked evacuation efforts, sometimes out of genuine belief that defensive lines would hold, more often out of fear that authorizing evacuations would be interpreted as defeatism and result in their own arrest. In many towns, party officials remained in place, issuing optimistic assessments until Soviet tanks appeared, then fled westward in commandeered vehicles, leaving the civilian population with no transportation, no warning, and no plan. The civilians fled anyway, on foot if necessary, because staying was suicide. The roads westward, filled with columns of refugees trudging through winter conditions without food, without shelter, without destination, moving simply because westward meant survival and eastward meant death. The psychology of the refugee columns defies clinical description. These were people who had lost everything, who had watched Soviet forces overrun their homes, who had no clear destination and no clear plan beyond continuing to move west. They walked until exhausted, slept in barns or in snow, walked further the next day. Children froze to death on these marches. Elderly people collapsed and were left behind because stopping to help them meant death for everyone. The columns pressed forward regardless because forward was west and west was survival. The columns moved with mechanical determination, without hope, without despair, without emotion, simply moving because movement was life and stopping was death. German soldiers in the final months developed a psychology that military historians struggle to categorize. They were not operating under traditional military discipline. The command structure had collapsed to the point where orders from higher headquarters often never arrived, and when they did arrive, were often ignored as obsolete or impossible. They were not operating under ideological motivation. The grand narratives of racial struggle had dissolved into the immediate facts of artillery fire and advancing tanks. They were operating under a form of collective survival instinct that resembled military discipline in external appearance, but was internally quite different. The soldier who held his position under fire was not demonstrating courage. He was calculating that remaining with his unit in a defensive position offered better survival odds than attempting solo flight. The soldier who participated in counterattacks was not demonstrating offensive spirit. He was calculating that keeping Soviet forces at distance was preferable to allowing them to close range. Every action that resembled military competence was actually survival calculation. The foreign SS volunteers fighting in the final battles embodied this transformation most clearly. The French SS Charlemagne Division fought in the defense of Berlin with intensity that impressed even hardened Wehrmacht veterans. These French volunteers were not fighting for Hitler or for Germany or for any ideological cause. They were fighting because they had nowhere else to go, because France would execute them as traitors, because Soviet forces would execute them immediately, because their only chance of survival was to fight until Western Allied forces reached Berlin, or until the war ended and they could attempt to blend into the chaos. They fought like fanatics because fanaticism was rational self-interest. The Scandinavian volunteers in the SS Nordland Division faced similar calculations. Norway and Denmark would not welcome them home. Soviet forces would not take them prisoner. Their only path to survival was fighting westward until they could surrender to Western Allied forces. They fought through Pomerania. They fought in the defense of Berlin. They fought in the final breakout attempts, not out of ideological commitment, but because every alternative was death. When SS Nordland survivors finally surrendered to Western Allied forces in early May, they had not abandoned their cause. They had simply reached the end of the fighting and found themselves still alive. The Volkssturm battalions presented the other end of the spectrum. These were men drafted in their 50s and 60s, given minimal training and inadequate weapons, told to defend their home districts against Soviet tank armies. They were not expected to win. They were expected to delay, to force Soviet forces to deploy artillery and conduct set-piece assaults instead of simply racing through undefended towns. The military value of Volkssturm resistance was marginal at best. A Volkssturm battalion armed with rifles and Panzerfausts could delay a Soviet regiment for a few hours before being overrun. Those few hours gave civilians additional time to flee westward. Whether this justified the Volkssturm casualties was a question that had no answer because no one was asking it. The Volkssturm fought because they had been ordered to fight, and because not fighting meant Soviet forces would arrive unopposed. And because if Soviet forces were going to arrive anyway, dying with a weapon in hand was better than dying defenseless. The deployment of Hitler Youth in combat roles represented the regime's final abandonment of any pretense of restraint. Boys aged 14 to 16 were organized into anti-tank hunting teams, given Panzerfausts, and told to ambush Soviet armor. Some of these boys managed to destroy tanks and survived the experience. Most were killed immediately or shortly thereafter. The military value of Hitler Youth deployments was essentially nil. A boy with a Panzerfaust might destroy one tank before being killed. A trained infantry squad with proper anti-tank weapons might destroy multiple tanks and survive to fight again. The deployment of children reflected not military calculation, but the complete exhaustion of adult manpower and the regime's willingness to sacrifice the next generation in a war that had already been lost. The transformation of German military culture from professional competence to survival desperation produced behavior that appeared contradictory when viewed through conventional military analysis. German units would fight with extraordinary intensity to hold a tactically insignificant position, then suddenly collapse and retreat in chaos when the position became untenable. This pattern appears irrational until understood through the lens of survival calculation. The unit fought intensely to hold the position because holding meant staying together as a unit, maintaining weapons and organization, keeping Soviet forces at distance. The unit collapsed when the position became untenable because at that point collective defense was no longer possible and individual survival required immediate flight. The transition from disciplined defense to chaotic retreat was not a failure of leadership. It was rational response to changing survival odds. The regime's propaganda in the final weeks abandoned all military or political content and focused exclusively on existential threat. The posters no longer promised victory. They depicted what would happen if Soviet forces occupied Germany. The newsreels no longer showed German advances. They showed German civilians fleeing westward and described in graphic detail what awaited those who did not flee. The radio broadcasts no longer discussed strategy. They provided updates on Soviet advance rates and instructions for evacuation. Goebbels had spent 5 years constructing propaganda narratives around German strength and inevitable victory. In the final weeks, he simply told the truth about what Soviet occupation would mean, and this truth was more effective than any lie had ever been. The complete collapse of the Eastern Front defences in the final weeks occurred not because German soldiers stopped fighting, but because the material basis for defence no longer existed. Artillery units ran out of ammunition and became infantry, tank units ran out of fuel and abandoned their vehicles, infantry units ran out of small arms ammunition and fought with captured weapons. Supply columns were ambushed or simply failed to arrive because the supply infrastructure had ceased to exist. German formations fought without air cover, without armoured support, without artillery preparation, often without communications with higher headquarters, fighting simply because they were in position, and Soviet forces were attacking, and there was nothing else to do. The Soviet advance in the final weeks was characterized by a mechanical inevitability that German resistance could slow but not stop. Soviet forces had overwhelming superiority in every category. When German defenders destroyed Soviet tanks, more Soviet tanks appeared. When German artillery fire broke up Soviet infantry assaults, more infantry appeared. The Soviet advantage was not tactical or operational. It was numerical and logistical. They could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them. This created a battlefield dynamic where German tactical competence was irrelevant. A perfectly executed defense might inflict heavy Soviet casualties and delay the Soviet advance by hours or days. And poorly executed defense would result in immediate German collapse. Both outcomes led to eventual German defeat. The only variable was how long the defeat took. The evacuation efforts in the final weeks took on an increasingly desperate character, as the number of people attempting to flee westward exceeded the transportation available by orders of magnitude. The Baltic ports could evacuate only a fraction of the refugees waiting to board ships. The roads westward were clogged with refugees moving faster than the military columns could retreat. Rail transportation collapsed as Soviet forces cut the main lines. What remained was walking. Millions of German civilians walked westward in the winter and spring of 1945, walked until they reached Western Allied forces, or until they could walk no further. The death toll of these evacuation marches was never accurately established, but hundreds of thousands of civilians died of exposure, starvation, or Soviet action during the westward flight. The final Soviet offensives in April and May 1945 were launched not to defeat German resistance, but to occupy territory before the Western Allies could reach it. Soviet forces raced westward toward the Elbe River, toward Berlin, toward Prague, advancing as rapidly as possible, regardless of German resistance or lack thereof. German forces attempting to surrender to Soviet forces in this final phase often found Soviet units unwilling to slow their advance to accept surrender. Soviet tank columns simply bypassed German formations, leaving them to surrender to follow-on infantry or to attempt to flee westward ahead of subsequent Soviet echelons. The war had become a race, Soviet forces racing westward to occupy maximum territory, German forces racing westward to escape Soviet occupation, civilians caught between the two racing masses and trying desperately to avoid being crushed. The meaning of the war's final phase extends beyond military history into questions of how societies collapse and how human beings behave when all structures of civilization dissolve. The German population in early 1945 experienced something that few populations in modern history have experienced: the complete and simultaneous collapse of military defense, state authority, economic function, and social order. This was not gradual decline. It was rapid systemic failure, where every institution that had provided stability and structure ceased to function within weeks. In this environment, human behavior reverted to fundamental survival imperatives. People moved west because west was survival. People stayed with groups because groups provided protection. People fought when necessary because fighting was sometimes better than the alternative. These were not moral choices or ideological choices. They were survival choices made in conditions where survival was itself uncertain. The transformation of the German war effort from a professional military enterprise in 1939 to a nation in flight in 1945 traces a descent through increasingly desperate stages. The Wehrmacht of 1939 fought wars of maneuver characterized by tactical brilliance and operational flexibility. The Wehrmacht of 1941 fought an ideological war of annihilation in Russia, but still operated within recognizable military frameworks. The Wehrmacht of 1943 fought defensive battles characterized by tactical competence but strategic exhaustion. The Wehrmacht of 1945 fought a war that was no longer a war in any conventional sense. It was armed survival, collective and individual, with military organization persisting only where it served survival needs and dissolving where it did not. The question of why German forces continued fighting in the final months, when defeat was mathematically certain and survival required surrender, has generated extensive historical debate. The answer lies not in ideology or discipline, but in the binary logic of survival under conditions where surrender to Soviet forces meant probable death. A German soldier on the Eastern Front in April 1945 faced a clear calculation. If he fought and died, he was dead. If he surrendered to Soviet forces, he would probably die in captivity. If he could reach Western Allied forces, he would probably survive. Fighting was therefore rational if fighting provided any possibility of delaying capture by Soviet forces or reaching Western Allied territory. This calculation produced behavior that resembled fanaticism, but was actually cold, rational self-interest. The regime understood this calculation and exploited it ruthlessly. The propaganda about Soviet atrocities was effective because it was largely true. The threat of execution for unauthorized withdrawal was effective because it was consistently applied. The promise that fighting would allow time for westward movement was effective because it was occasionally true. The regime no longer needed to manufacture motivation. It simply needed to ensure that German soldiers calculated correctly that fighting offered better survival odds than surrender, and then provide sufficient examples of execution to ensure that unauthorized withdrawal was not perceived as a third option. This system extracted the final drops of military effectiveness from a dying army by ensuring that every soldier's survival instinct pointed in the same direction, forward toward the enemy until the order to retreat, then westward as rapidly as possible. The civilian experience of this final phase was characterized by total loss of agency. German civilians in the Eastern Territories did not choose whether to stay or flee based on political loyalty or ideological commitment. They chose based on assessment of survival odds, and every shred of evidence indicated that staying meant death or worse. The civilians who fled in January and February 1945 were not cowards or defeatists. They were people who had correctly assessed that Soviet occupation would be catastrophic and that westward flight was their only chance of survival. The civilians who remained were not loyal party members. They were people too old or too sick to travel, people without transportation, people who waited too long and found their escape route cut off by Soviet advances. Their fate validated every refugee's decision to flee. The transformation of Germany from a functioning modern state to a zone of civilizational collapse occurred with remarkable speed. In October 1944, most of Germany functioned normally. Cities operated, factories produced, administration continued, civilian life proceeded. By April 1945, vast stretches of eastern Germany had ceased to exist as civil societies. The population had fled, the buildings were destroyed, the infrastructure was gone, the administrative apparatus had dissolved, nothing remained but ruins and corpses. This was not the slow decline of a failing state. This was rapid systems collapse where every element of modern civilization failed simultaneously and irreversibly. The transformation took 6 months. The lessons of this transformation extend well beyond military history. The German experience of 1945 demonstrates how quickly modern civilizations can collapse when military defeat combines with complete loss of territorial security. The population did not require extensive indoctrination to abandon their homes and flee westward. They simply required credible evidence that remaining in place was more dangerous than flight, and such evidence was abundantly available. The military forces did not require extensive ideological reinforcement to continue fighting in obviously hopeless conditions. They simply required a situation where fighting offered better survival odds than surrender, and the binary logic of Eastern versus Western Front made this calculation obvious. The state did not require popular support to extract final resources from the population. It simply required the ability to threaten death from multiple directions simultaneously and ensure that obedience offered the best chance of avoiding all these threats. The final weeks of the European War, from late April through early May 1945, saw the complete disintegration of German resistance, not through loss of will, but through loss of means. German soldiers wanted to continue fighting because fighting was preferable to surrender. They lacked the ammunition, fuel, food and material basis for continued fighting. German civilians wanted to continue fleeing westward, but found themselves trapped between collapsing fronts with no remaining escape routes. German commanders wanted to conduct organized retreats that would allow maximum personnel to reach Western Allied territory, but lacked communications, transportation, and control over formations that had dissolved into armed mobs. What remained was chaos, punctuated by isolated incidents of organized resistance that delayed the Soviet advance by hours before being overwhelmed. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.